The man with the torn jacket. It was a cold winter morning in downtown Los Angeles, the kind that slipped into your bones and stayed there. Fog draped the city like a veil, muting the sound of traffic and turning headlights into dim orbs of light cutting through the mist. The streets buzzed with hurried footsteps, people rushing to escape the chill and the burden of their daily routines. But just a few blocks away from the city's glittering skyline and polished high-rises, the world looked different. Here, worn-down buildings stood like tired warriors of time. Here, life moved slower, not out of choice, but necessity. This was Skid Row, where the city's forgotten gathered, a melting pot of hardship, resilience, and the invisible struggle of those who had once had it all, and lost it. The homeless shelter on 5th Street had been a beacon for many. Run by a small nonprofit and a team of compassionate volunteers, it provided hot meals, beds, and warmth, not just from heaters, but from the human touch that still believed in second chances. Inside the shelter's common room, about 20 people huddled together. Some chatted, others sipped on coffee from chipped mugs, and a few dozed off on benches. Among them sat a man with shaggy, dark hair and a beard that masked most of his face. He wore a torn brown jacket that barely held together at the seams and scuffed work boots with holes in the toes. He looked like just another drifter, another soul forgotten by time and fate. No one knew his name. He had walked in quietly 3 days ago, offering no explanation and asking for nothing more than a place to sleep and a warm plate. The shelter staff didn't push. They were used to that. People carrying more pain than words, more silence than stories. But he stood out, not for what he said, but how he behaved. He listened when others spoke. He offered his blanket to an old veteran one night without saying a word. He helped clean the mess hall without being asked. There was something gentle in the way he moved, something serene in his eyes, as if he knew life's cruel twists but had made peace with them. Still, not everyone saw it. A man named Bradley, tall, lean, with a scruffy goatee and a loud voice, made it a point to mock him. "Look at this guy," Bradley said on that particular morning, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Acts like he's some monk or something. You lost, brother. This ain't no movie set." A few people chuckled nervously, unsure whether to join in or look away. The man in the torn jacket just smiled. Not an arrogant smile. No smirk, no challenge. Just a soft, knowing smile, the kind that makes you question your own bitterness. That only made Bradley angrier. "Who even are you, huh? You talk to anyone. You just float around here like some kind of guru. What's your deal?" No response, just that same gentle smile. Bradley scoffed and turned to the others. "Watch. I bet he's just another burnout. Some ex-wannabe actor who thought he'd make it big and got crushed by the industry. Now look at him, eating free meals and sleeping next to rats." That stung some of the people nearby, because many of them had come from failed dreams. Some had tried to be musicians, actors, even writers. Los Angeles was a city that offered stars and swallowed souls. Still, no one said anything. The man stood, walked over to the coffee table, and poured himself a small cup. He turned back to Bradley, and without a hint of anger, said softly, "You ever think maybe some people end up here not because they failed, but because they chose to be where they were needed?" Bradley blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man didn't answer. He walked over to the old veteran he had helped the night before and offered him the coffee instead. The room grew quiet. Later that day, a young volunteer named Melissa walked into the shelter, her arms full of groceries. She was in her 20s, wide-eyed and full of hope. She had started volunteering just 2 months ago and already felt like this shelter was more of a home than her expensive downtown apartment. "Hey guys," she chirped, trying to bring cheer to the dim room. "We got more peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, fresh bread, and oh, Mr. Wilkins donated some apples." There were faint smiles, polite nods. People shuffled to help her unpack. Then she saw the man in the torn jacket. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. No, it couldn't be. She walked over, hesitating. "Excuse me," she said gently, tapping his shoulder. "I don't mean to intrude, but are you?" He raised a finger to his lips and smiled again. "Not here," he whispered. Melissa blinked in disbelief. Her heart was pounding. She knew that voice. She had seen him, not just on screens, but in interviews, in films that had saved her on lonely nights. Her favorite movie growing up had been The Matrix. She had posters of Neo on her wall. This man was Keanu Reeves. But why was he here? In this place? She nodded silently and walked away, her mind spinning. That night, she sat outside on the shelter steps. The air was crisp, and the city's distant hum played like background music to her thoughts. A quiet shuffle of footsteps behind her broke the silence. "I'm sorry if I startled you," came the familiar voice. Melissa turned. "It is you, isn't it?" she whispered. Keanu sat beside her, hands tucked into his jacket. "I come here sometimes," he said, "not to be recognized, not to be seen, just to be." Melissa's eyes watered. "But why? You could be anywhere." Keanu looked at the street lamp across the road. "Because people here are real. Their pain is real. Their hope, even when it's a flicker, is real. Out there," he motioned toward the city skyline, "a lot of things are fake." Melissa stayed quiet. He continued, "I've been blessed, Melissa, with a career, with love, with loss. I've walked in darkness and still found the light. I come here not because I'm broken, but because I understand brokenness. And I believe that kindness isn't about charity. It's about presence, showing up when no one expects you to, listening when no one else will, holding someone's hand when they're falling and saying, 'I'm here.'" Melissa wiped a tear from her cheek. "That's beautiful." He smiled. "You don't need to tell anyone. Let them laugh. Let them assume. That man today, Bradley, he's hurting. He hides it with anger, but it's there. He doesn't need my name. He needs my patience." Inside the shelter, Bradley sat on his cot, staring at the ceiling. He was remembering something from years ago, a time when he was the one offering food, not receiving it. A time when his daughter still called him, when his wife hadn't walked out, when dreams hadn't crumbled, and he remembered the man's smile. That damned smile. Why didn't it bother him more? Why did it feel comforting? He sighed and rolled over. The next morning, Bradley found himself standing in line for coffee again. The man in the torn jacket stood ahead of him. For a moment, Bradley almost said something snarky, but something in him hesitated. Instead, he tapped the man's shoulder. "Hey," he muttered. Thanks for what you said yesterday. About choosing to be where you're needed." The man turned, surprised. "No problem," he said warmly. I used to be someone. I mean, I had a business, a family, everything. Then I lost it, and now I'm here." "That doesn't mean you're not someone anymore," the man said. "Sometimes we find ourselves in the ashes, and sometimes we build something even stronger from them." Bradley nodded slowly. "What's your name, anyway?" he asked. The man paused. Then, for the first time, he offered it. "Keanu." Bradley blinked. "Like Keanu Reeves." The man smiled again, exactly like him. And with that, he walked away, leaving Bradley with a million questions and a heart that felt just a little lighter. The silence behind the smile. Morning broke quietly over the city, casting soft orange hues against the crumbling facades of Skid Row. The air was still, as though even time itself paused for a moment in this forgotten corner of Los Angeles. Inside the shelter, the day began the same as always. The smell of burnt coffee, the creak of worn-out bunks, the shuffle of tired feet seeking warmth, purpose, or maybe just a moment of peace. But something had shifted since yesterday. Whispers carried from one bunk to another. A name floated like a ghost through the stale air. Keanu. Some thought it was a joke. Others scoffed. But there were those few, those who had looked into the man's eyes, who had felt the calm he radiated, who began to believe. And belief, in a place like this, was powerful. It was the difference between surviving and simply existing. Bradley sat on the edge of his cot, rubbing his temples, trying to make sense of everything. The name still echoed in his head. Keanu. Could it really be him? No, it couldn't. Why would a world-famous actor be living among them? Why would he sleep on floors that creaked and eat canned soup from dented trays? Why would someone like that choose this life? But he had seen the man's eyes up close now. There was no arrogance, no ego, just pain, grace, and something deeper, wisdom that doesn't come from money or fame, but from walking through fire and choosing not to become bitter. Bradley sighed. The weight of his past pressed against his chest like a stone. It had been 4 years since he had last spoken to his daughter. The court dates, the custody battles, the alcohol, the nights spent shouting at the stars. They had all stolen his future in tiny pieces. He hadn't cried in months, maybe years, but now something within him cracked. Just a hairline fracture, enough to let a sliver of light in. Across the room, Keanu, still in that same ragged brown jacket, sat cross-legged, polishing the boots of the shelter's elderly janitor. He wasn't doing it for attention. In fact, he had done it quietly, without announcement, the same way he swept the floors last night after everyone had gone to sleep. He moved like a man who had nothing to prove and everything to give. Melissa entered with her clipboard and a box of energy bars. She greeted everyone like she always did, but her eyes lingered on Keanu, still grappling with what she now knew. The image of him in black leather dodging bullets on screen clashed violently with the image before her. A man bent over someone else's boots, his hands gentle, his presence silent and steady. It was humbling, and it made her wonder how often she had walked past people like him, people who had chosen humility in a world obsessed with pride. Later that afternoon, the shelter's small garden, really just a corner with 2 benches and a few potted plants, became a haven for unlikely conversation. Bradley found himself sitting beside Keanu, the silence between them oddly comfortable. "You're not going to tell anyone, are you?" Keanu asked softly, not looking up. Bradley shook his head. "No. I don't think they'd believe me even if I did." Keanu chuckled. "That's the beauty of being forgotten. It gives you freedom." Bradley looked at him, really looked. "Why are you here, man? I mean, you could be anywhere in the world. You could be sitting in a 5-star hotel right now, sipping imported wine and flying first class." Keanu leaned back and exhaled slowly. "There was a time I had all that. The hotels, the red carpets, the applause. But applause fades. The money sits in an account. The parties feel empty. I realized I was surrounded by noise, but inside, I was silent, numb." Bradley nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. Keanu continued, "When my sister was diagnosed with leukemia, everything changed. Suddenly, movie premieres didn't matter. Awards didn't matter. I spent months by her side, watching her fight, watching her smile through the pain. And then, I lost her." His voice cracked, just a little, but it was enough. "I'd lost a lot of people, Bradley. My best friend, my child, the woman I loved. They're all gone. And when you lose that much, something inside you shifts. You stop chasing the spotlight. You start looking for something real, something human." Bradley stared at the ground. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't expected honesty. Not like this. "I come here," Keanu said after a pause, "not because I need saving, but because I want to remind people that they're not alone. That even someone like me, someone people think has everything, understands what it feels like to have nothing." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Bradley wiped at his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie. I was a contractor, ran my own business for 20 years, had a daughter named Lily, brightest kid you'd ever meet. Then I drank it all away. Divorce, lost custody, ended up on the street. I stopped believing people could change. But you're messing with my head, man. Keanu smiled faintly. We all break, Bradley. The question is, what do we do with the pieces? That evening, something unexpected happened at the shelter. The shelter director, Mrs. Thompson, a sturdy woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a kind heart, called for everyone to gather in the common area. A donor had given extra funds this month, and she wanted to start a new program. A storytelling circle. Once a week, residents could share their stories. No judgment, no interruption. Just raw, unfiltered truth. Some rolled their eyes. Others laughed. But a few leaned forward with interest. To everyone's surprise, Keanu was the first to stand. No one interrupted as he made his way to the front. He stood there, the light casting long shadows behind him, and simply said, "I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to remind you that your story matters." And then he told them about the years of grief, the loneliness behind hotel curtains, the depression that wrapped around him like chains. He didn't mention his fame. Not once. He spoke like a man who had walked through fire, barefoot, and chose to keep walking, not away, but toward the flames others had been left to burn in. By the time he sat down, the room was silent. And then Bradley stood up. "My name is Bradley. I haven't told anyone that in years. I thought my story ended when I hit rock bottom. But maybe it's just beginning again." It wasn't some magical moment where everyone clapped and cried. No, it was quieter than that. More real. But in that silence, something was born. Hope. The days that followed were different. Keanu still wore the same jacket, still swept the floors and helped distribute meals. But now, people saw him. Not as an actor, not as a celebrity, but as someone who had chosen to walk beside them. He started teaching a small writing workshop on Thursdays. Nothing fancy, just blank notebooks, borrowed pens, and encouragement. He called it Pages of the Past, and slowly the shelter transformed. Not physically, but spiritually. People began talking, healing, sharing. Even Bradley, who had once mocked him, now sat beside him most evenings, writing letters to his daughter he hoped to one day send. And through it all, Keanu remained the same, gentle, quiet, present, not seeking attention, not chasing gratitude, just being there, a steady light in a dark place. Melissa watched this all unfold with awe. She had joined the shelter thinking she would be the one offering help. But now she realized she was the one being changed. One afternoon, she sat with Keanu near the garden. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He nodded. "What keeps you going? After all the loss, all the pain?" Keanu looked up at the sky, the clouds drifting lazily overhead. "Because every morning I wake up, I have a choice," he said softly. "To let my pain make me bitter, or make me better. I choose better. Even if it's hard, even if I fall, I choose to get up. Because somewhere, someone else is hurting more. And maybe my presence can be the thing that keeps them from giving up." Melissa swallowed the lump in her throat. "You're not just helping them," she whispered. "You're helping me." Keanu looked at her, his eyes kind. "Then I'm exactly where I need to be." But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because soon, someone would walk into the shelter, someone who would recognize him. And the quiet life he had built here, the anonymity he cherished, would begin to unravel. And when it did, Bradley would be the first to stand up for him. Because sometimes the people you once laughed at become the ones who teach you how to live again. The mask slits. The days had found a rhythm in the shelter, an unexpected, fragile harmony that no one dared speak too loudly about, for fear it might vanish. The air still smelled like old carpet and reheated soup, and the walls still bore chipped paint and forgotten handprints, but something beneath it all had shifted. There was a quiet dignity now, a sense that even here, where the world had seemingly left people behind, something sacred was taking root. Keanu remained at the heart of it, not because he demanded attention, but precisely because he didn't. He became a mirror, a silent presence that reflected back the humanity people had forgotten they still possessed. The writing workshops grew, the storytelling circles deepened, and even the most hardened souls, men and women who hadn't cried in decades, began to open up. But peace has a way of drawing the unexpected. It happened on a Saturday morning, as the sun broke through thick clouds and spilled golden light into the shelter's modest courtyard. Volunteers were unloading donated clothes, and Alyssa stood by the gate, checking inventory with a clipboard in hand. A luxury car, a sleek, matte black SUV with tinted windows, rolled to a stop just outside the gate, contrasting so sharply with the chipped concrete it might as well have landed from another planet. From the driver's side stepped a young man, early 30s, expensive sunglasses, pressed designer coat. He looked like he had just come from an award show, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the pavement. Melissa's brow furrowed. Visitors like this didn't come to give, not usually. The man walked directly to the gate, his eyes scanning every face. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm looking for someone." Melissa stepped forward. "This is a homeless shelter, not a tour. We respect people's privacy here." The man smiled, the kind of smile people wear when they believe rules don't apply to them. "Oh, I know. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need a moment of someone's time. I think he'll want to see me." "Who exactly are you looking for?" The man pulled off his sunglasses and leaned in slightly. "Keanu Reeves." Melissa's stomach dropped. "I think you're mistaken," she said quickly, but her voice shook. The man smirked. "No, I'm not. He's here, and we need to talk." He stepped inside without waiting for permission, his presence slicing through the shelter like a cold wind. People looked up from their bowls and conversations, their eyes narrowing at the stranger who didn't belong. And then he saw him, sitting at the far end of the room, head bowed, notebook open in his lap, writing quietly as always. Keanu looked up the moment the man approached. Their eyes met. There was no anger on Keanu's face, no panic, just a soft exhale, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Victor," he said calmly. "Keanu," the man replied, his tone laced with unspoken tension. Everyone nearby went quiet. Bradley, who had been playing a quiet game of chess with another resident, stood up instinctively. He didn't know who the man was, but something about his energy set off alarm bells in his gut. "I didn't expect you to find me," Keanu said. Victor crossed his arms. "You really thought you could disappear forever? You're trending online for not showing up to a press tour. Your agent's losing his mind. Studios are panicking. You've ghosted the world, and here you are, sweeping floors and playing therapist to strangers in a shelter." Keanu stood slowly, the notebook still in his hand. "I'm where I need to be." Victor laughed bitterly. "Don't do that. Don't give me the enlightened monk routine. You've got contracts, responsibilities. You walk out like this, you'll be blacklisted." "I walked away from expectations, not from people," Keanu said, his voice low but steady. "The world doesn't need another movie star. It needs people willing to see others, to listen, to show up in places no one wants to go." Victor shook his head. "This is insane. You have no idea what kind of damage you're causing." Bradley stepped forward, fists slightly clenched. "Hey, maybe he does know. Maybe you're the one who doesn't get it." Victor turned sharply. "And who are you?" Bradley met his gaze evenly. "Someone who laughed at him once, and learned better." A murmur passed through the room. Keanu stepped between them. "It's all right, Bradley. He's just doing his job." But Bradley wasn't finished. "Your world out there, the suits, the lights, the cameras, it chews people up, pretends to care until someone breaks. Then it moves on. You know what this man's been doing for us? He listens. He teaches. He remembers our names. He showed me how to feel again. And you want to drag him back to flashbulbs and fake smiles. Victor stared at Bradley, clearly thrown. Keanu placed a hand gently on Bradley's shoulder. Thank you. Then he turned to Victor. I'm not quitting forever, but I needed time. I needed truth, not scripts, not red carpets. This place reminded me of who I am beneath the applause. Victor's voice softened slightly. You don't owe these people anything, Keanu. But that's where you're wrong, Keanu replied. I do owe them something. Because when the world claps for you long enough, you start believing it. And you forget how to clap for others. I'm here to remember. Victor looked around. The room was filled with people who had nothing. No fame, no followers, no financial security. And yet, they looked at Keanu as if he were family. Not because he was famous, but because he had shown up. There was a long pause. Finally, Victor sighed and pulled out a card. If you ever decide to come back, this is my new number. Just don't disappear completely. The world still needs you too. Keanu nodded and took the card. As Victor turned to leave, Melissa quietly followed him out and closed the gate behind him. That evening, the shelter buzzed. No one outright said the words Keanu Reeves. It felt too sacred now. But they talked. Not about the films or the fame, but about the choice, about what it meant to walk away from the world's idea of success and walk towards something real. Bradley sat beside Keanu on the garden bench once more. Guess the cat's out of the bag, he said. Keanu chuckled. Maybe. But it doesn't change why I'm here. You really going back? Bradley asked quietly. Keanu looked up at the stars beginning to pierce the night sky. Someday. Maybe. But I'll never leave this behind. Not completely. Because it's home? Bradley asked. Keanu smiled. Because it's real. Inside, Melissa sat alone, replaying the confrontation in her head. The shock, the tension, the dignity. She realized something then. Something she hadn't understood until now. Keanu wasn't just being kind. He was choosing it. Over and over. In every conversation, in every moment. Even when it cost him something. Even when the world told him to be something else. And maybe that was the real message. That kindness isn't just a feeling. It's a decision. In the following days, word began to spread quietly, somehow, as whispers tend to do. A few curious faces appeared at the shelter's gates. People claiming they just wanted to volunteer. Others claiming to be from small blogs or local networks. But the staff held firm. No interviews. No cameras. No circus. Bradley started walking with Keanu in the early mornings before sunrise. They didn't always talk. Sometimes, they just watched the world wake up. The garbage trucks, the pigeons, the early joggers who didn't make eye contact. One morning, Keanu turned to him and said, "You should call her. Your daughter." Bradley looked away. "She probably hates me. She probably misses you. And what if she doesn't want to talk?" Keanu gave him a look. "Then you'll know, and you'll be free. Either way, you'll be one step closer to healing." Bradley nodded. It terrified him, but it also made sense. That night, Bradley sat with Melissa and asked if he could borrow her phone. His hands trembled as he dialed the number from memory. It rang once, twice. Then, "Hello," her voice. His eyes welled up. "Lily, it's Dad." Silence. Then a small, trembling breath. "Dad." And just like that, something long dead came back to life. Outside, under the stars, Keanu sat alone with his notebook, writing something he'd never show anyone. "A man laughed at me once, but I didn't laugh back. I waited. And one day, that man found his voice again. Sometimes, you don't fight the world by shouting louder. You fight it by sitting beside the broken and whispering, 'You still matter.'" Letters from the ashes. The shelter had begun to breathe in a new way. What was once a place of survival had slowly, almost imperceptibly, turned into a place of reflection, restoration, and even purpose. The walls still bore the scars of time, graffiti buried under layers of cheap paint, bulletin boards sagging under the weight of old flyers, but something had shifted in the soul of the place. People began holding their heads higher. Conversation stretched longer into the night, and the new ritual, Thursday writing circles hosted by Keanu, had become the most anticipated part of the week. Not because anyone expected wisdom, but because they found safety. They didn't just write. They remembered. Not just what they lost, but who they had been before the world forgot them. It was in that sacred hour on a chilly Thursday evening that Bradley stood in front of the group holding a folded piece of notebook paper. He started, swallowing hard. I wrote something. A letter. He unfolded the paper slowly, his calloused hands trembling slightly. Everyone leaned in, not to judge, but to listen. In this space, pain wasn't something to hide. It was currency, the thing that connected them all. To my daughter Lily, he began, his voice low and uneven. I know you don't owe me a single second of your time. I know I missed too many birthdays, too many chances to show up. I let anger and liquor speak louder than love, and I spent years convincing myself I didn't care. But that was a lie. He paused, the words catching in his throat. I saw your graduation photo last week. Melissa found it online. You look just like your mom. I cried for the first time in years because it hit me how much I missed. And yet, I still hope that maybe you'll let me show up, even if it's just once, even if it's just to say I'm sorry. I love you, Lily, more than I ever knew how to say. The room was silent, not because they were shocked, but because they understood. When he finished, he didn't look up. He simply handed the paper to Keanu. Will you mail it for me? He whispered. Keanu nodded. I'll do more than that. I'll walk it to the post office myself. That was the kind of man Keanu was. He didn't promise miracles. He promised presence. Outside, the seasons were shifting. Spring crept into the city like a quiet guest, softening the edges of cold nights and coaxing little blooms from sidewalk cracks. And in that fragile rebirth, something beautiful happened inside the shelter. The residents began to believe again, not in some grand overnight transformation, but in themselves. One woman, Ruthie, who hadn't spoken more than 3 words in months, asked if she could read one of her poems. A former musician named Jonah found an old guitar in a thrift shop and began teaching chords on Saturdays. Melissa started a small bulletin board where residents could pin letters, poems, or dreams. They called it the Wall of Light. And at the center of it all, Keanu kept doing what he had always done. Listening, sharing, sweeping floors when no one was looking. The truth was, no one cared about the man he was on screen anymore. They had fallen in love with the man he chose to be when the cameras were gone. But the outside world wasn't done knocking. One late afternoon, a familiar car pulled up outside the shelter, sleek, dark, and entirely out of place. Victor stepped out again. But this time, he looked different. Less urgent, less impatient. He wasn't here with ultimatums. He was here with something else. Keanu met him at the gate. I didn't expect to see you back, he said calmly. Victor offered a small smile. I told you the world still needs you. I didn't say how. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Victor reached into his coat and pulled out a manila envelope. A foundation, he said. We've been discussing it for months, but it never clicked. Until I saw what you've been doing here. What if, instead of another franchise or press tour, we build something that matters, something that doesn't end when the credits roll? Keanu took the envelope slowly. Inside were concept notes, nonprofit paperwork drafts, and a proposal to fund a long-term shelter-to-success program, one that included writing workshops, counseling, transitional housing, and real career training. All under one name, Project Still Human. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He looked over the courtyard, where Jana was teaching a group of residents how to strum a G chord, where Ruthie was pinning a new poem on the wall of light, where Bradley was sitting by the window, watching the mailbox for any sign of a response from Lily. "This isn't about me," Keanu said softly. "No," Victor said. "It's about what you started." That night, Keanu gathered the group in the common room. He didn't make a speech. He didn't announce the foundation. Instead, he told a story about a time in his 20s when he used to sleep on friends' couches, scrounging for auditions, unsure if he had anything worth offering. About the night he sat alone in a diner, broke and scared, and a waitress gave him free coffee without a word. "She didn't save my life," he said, "but she reminded me it was still worth living." He paused. Sometimes kindness doesn't come with fanfare. It comes in quiet moments, with no audience. That's what this place is. And then he added, "But maybe we can build more places like this. Maybe we can be the coffee someone needs at 2 a.m. They didn't cheer. They just nodded, some wiping tears, some smiling softly. Because they knew what it meant. The shelter began transforming. Quietly, slowly, but powerfully. Melissa took charge of organizing the foundation's launch. Local volunteers grew. Donations trickled in. More writing materials were brought in. Local businesses offered internship opportunities, and perhaps most beautiful of all, the residents started leading. Bradley became the workshop assistant. Ruthie ran a poetry circle every other Monday. Jonah led music nights. The shelter was no longer a place to sleep. It had become a place to heal. And still, Keanu never moved out. He had offers, of course. Luxury penthouses, private retreats. But he stayed. Because he had found something here no hotel suite could offer. Belonging without expectation. Then, one rainy evening, something unexpected arrived. Melissa burst into the common room, breathless, holding a letter. "Bradley," she called. "It's from Lily." The room froze. Bradley stood slowly, every heartbeat pounding like thunder in his chest. He took the letter with trembling hands, staring at his name written in clean, careful handwriting. He didn't open it in front of them. He took it outside, to the garden bench, where Keanu soon joined him. Bradley sat silently, then finally unfolded the paper. He read it once, twice. Then he crumpled forward, sobbing into his hands, not from grief, but from a flood of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. She forgave me, he whispered. She wants to meet. Keanu said nothing. He just placed a hand on his shoulder and sat there with him, under the soft patter of rain, both of them quiet, both of them smiling through tears. In the days that followed, Bradley cleaned up, not because anyone asked him to, but because he wanted to. He shaved, got a haircut, found a clean shirt in the donation pile. On the day he left to see Lily, the entire shelter stood outside to wish him well. "You're gonna do great," Keanu said. Bradley hugged him tight. "I'm gonna come back. You know that, right?" "I know," Keanu said. "This is your home too." That night, Keanu sat under the stars with his notebook once more. He wrote, "Sometimes the hardest thing to believe is that we are still worthy of love after we've fallen. But love isn't about perfection. It's about presence. I've seen it now, in the quiet courage of broken men, in the shaky voices of women finding their strength again. And if all I ever do is sit beside them in their silence, then I will have lived a life that matters." A place called worth. The rhythm of the shelter had changed again, but not because something was lost, rather because something was gained. When Bradley left to meet his daughter, he didn't leave behind a hole. He left behind proof that healing wasn't just possible, it was contagious, and it rippled through the walls of the shelter like an unseen wind. The regulars who once shuffled in with heads low now walked in differently, straighter backs, softer eyes. Conversations stretched longer. Silences became more peaceful. It wasn't just because Keanu was still there. It was because people had started believing in themselves. And belief, once lit, is a fire that spreads in the coldest places. Keanu spent most mornings in the corner garden now, tending to the tiny tomato plants someone had donated. It had become a quiet ritual. Not glamorous, not grand. Just his hands in the soil, grounding him in something real, something honest. It was during one of those mornings that a woman named Carla approached. She had been living at the shelter for almost a year. 52, wiry hair, eyes that held old sadness and new strength. She had never spoken to Keanu beyond a few passing hellos. But today, she stood in front of him, holding a wrinkled envelope. "I wrote this last night," she said, her voice thin. "It's not good, but it's honest. I thought maybe you could read it." Keanu wiped his hands on a towel and took the envelope gently, as if it contained something fragile. "You want me to read it now?" She hesitated, then nodded. He sat on the bench, unfolded the page, and began reading. It wasn't polished, it wasn't poetic, but it was real. Carla had written about the night she left her abusive husband, the fear of sleeping under bridges, the shame of begging for food, the night she almost gave up completely. But the last paragraph, it bloomed like a flower in winter. "But then I saw a man in a ripped jacket sweeping the shelter floor, not because he had to, but because he cared. And I remembered I used to be that kind of person too. So I started smiling again. Not big, not all the time. Just little ones. And the little ones got bigger. I think I'm learning how to live again." Thanks to a stranger who wasn't really a stranger at all. When he looked up, Carla was crying. "I don't know why I wrote it," she whispered. "I just needed to say it." Keanu folded the letter gently and stood. "You wrote it because your voice matters," he said. "Because you are not invisible. And this story, it's not just yours anymore. It's everyone's." Carla nodded and walked away, lighter somehow, like she'd set down a suitcase she didn't know she'd been carrying for decades. Later that day, Melissa gathered a few of the residents and proposed something new. "A book," she said, grinning. "We compile the letters, the journal entries, the poems, everything. We publish it, not for profit, but to show the world who you are, to remind people what strength really looks like." The idea lit a spark. Ruthie volunteered to design the cover. Jonah offered to compose a theme for an audiobook version. And the others, men and women who had once doubted they even belonged in the world, began sifting through their writings with a sense of purpose. They titled it Still Human, Stories from the Edges. Keanu agreed to write the foreword, not as a celebrity, not as a hero, but as a man who chose to listen when no one else would. And just when it seemed things had settled into a beautiful kind of motion, life sent another reminder that growth often arrives wrapped in challenge. One evening, a reporter showed up. Uninvited. He wasn't from some major outlet, but the type who dug for sensational stories, always looking for the twist behind the headline. He had heard whispers about a famous actor hiding in a homeless shelter. And now, there he was, voice recorder in hand, camera slung around his neck, a smirk like he already knew more than he should. Melissa met him at the gate. "This is private property," she said firmly. "You're not welcome here." "I'm not here to harass anyone," he replied, holding up his hands. "Just want the truth. People deserve to know if one of the world's most recognizable faces is pretending to be poor for fun." Melissa's eyes flashed. "He's not pretending. And you clearly have no idea what's happening here." Inside, the tension spread fast. Keanu heard the raised voices and quietly made his way to the gate. He approached slowly, calmly. "It's all right," he told Melissa. Then he turned to the reporter. "You want an interview?" The man blinked. "Wait, seriously?" Keanu nodded. "But not here. We'll take a walk." And just like that, they disappeared down the street. No cameras, no microphones, just two men walking side by side into the evening light. They returned 40 minutes later. The reporter didn't say a word. He just gave a quiet nod to Keanu and walked away. Melissa rushed to him. "What did you say to him?" Keanu smiled faintly. I told him the truth. And he believed you. He didn't have to. But he felt it. The article came out the next week. The headline read, "Not a star, but a soul. Keanu Reeves and the shelter that saved more than lives." It was surprisingly beautiful, honest, respectful, and it sparked something unexpected. An outpouring of support from around the world. Not for Keanu. For the shelter. Donations, letters, offers to volunteer, notes from people who had once lived on the street and never thought anyone cared. They sent thousands of copies of the article to print. It hung on the shelter's wall now, beside Carla's letter and Bradley's poem, and Jonah's music sheet. A wall that once held broken flyers now held rebirth. The foundation, Project Still Human, officially launched that spring. But it wasn't just a name on paper, it was real. It had grown roots in this tiny, forgotten place. It had faces, stories, names. It had hope, wrapped in torn jackets and worn-out boots, and it didn't care how you got there, only that you knew you belonged. Keanu declined every interview offer that came with it. He didn't want a brand. He wanted a community. He stayed in the shelter, kept teaching, kept sweeping, kept showing up. Then, one night, while locking up the pantry, he heard a familiar voice. "Looks like someone still hasn't upgraded his jacket." He turned. Bradley stood in the doorway, dressed cleanly, with a small suitcase in hand. But this time, he wasn't just visiting. "I'm back," he grinned. "Told Lily I needed to finish something." Keanu pulled him into a long hug. "You didn't have to come back," he said. "I know," Bradley replied. "But I wanted to. Because I finally realized something." He paused, looking around the room that had held his most broken moments. "This place, it didn't just help me get back on my feet. It reminded me that I never stopped being worthy. I just forgot." Keanu smiled. "We all forget, sometimes." That night, in his notebook, Keanu wrote, "Sometimes the greatest gift we give is not money, or shelter, or food. It's the mirror we hold up, the one that lets others see their own strength again. If I've done anything here, it's only because I refuse to look away. Because everyone, every last soul, is still human, still worth loving, still worth fighting for. The light we leave behind." The city moved on, as cities do, always fast, always hungry. But inside that small shelter on 5th Street, time had carved out a sacred stillness. What had once been a simple place to rest heads and serve warm meals had become something much bigger. It had become a lighthouse, not to warn people of danger, but to remind them there was still a way back to themselves. Keanu remained there, not as a guest, not as a hero, but as part of it, indistinguishable from the place itself. If you walked through those doors now, you wouldn't find a movie star waiting for applause. You'd find a man helping unload bread from a food truck. A man kneeling beside a sobbing stranger, just listening. A man wearing the same brown jacket, now patched in several places by grateful hands, refusing to be replaced. Project Still Human had become more than a dream. It was alive. It expanded to 3 more shelters in other cities, each modeled after what had happened here, rooted not in charity, but in dignity. Not in giving, but in seeing. The book, Still Human, Stories from the Edges, became a quiet sensation. It didn't top bestseller lists. It didn't need to. It found its way into classrooms, therapy offices, prisons, and halfway homes. Letters poured in. From teenagers who had felt invisible. From veterans who had stopped talking. From CEOs who finally saw their privilege. The stories inside those pages lit fires all over the world, and yet Keanu never once took credit. He never gave speeches, never signed his name to anything but his notebook. "I'm just one part of the thread," he always said. "But together, we make the fabric." One evening, Bradley returned from visiting Lily for the 3rd time. His eyes were brighter now. His face, once worn and tired, had begun to carry something new. Peace. She's letting me be part of her life again, he said to Keanu as they stood under the shelter's garden lights. It's not perfect, but it's real. And that's enough. Keanu clapped him on the back. You earned it. No, Bradley corrected gently. We earned it. You didn't just help me believe in myself. You showed me how to believe in others again. They sat in silence for a while after that, just watching the stars blink through city haze. A week later, something unexpected arrived. A letter. Handwritten. Delivered with care. It wasn't addressed to the shelter, but to Keanu directly. It was from Victor. He had taken a job overseas, working on a global humanitarian film project. But the letter wasn't about business. It was personal. You were right, Keanu, it read. Fame without purpose is a prison. I watched what you did in that shelter. I didn't understand it at first, but I do now. You didn't step away from the spotlight to run. You stepped into the shadows to remind people they still existed. I envy that kind of courage. Thank you for helping me see that real stories aren't always the ones that get the most attention. They're the ones that change hearts quietly, one person at a time. Keanu folded the letter and placed it in his notebook. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Some stories don't require words, just echoes. Then came the night that changed everything. A large storm rolled in, unexpected, brutal. Wind tore through the streets. Rain slammed against the roof in furious waves. The shelter lost power for several hours. Flashlights flickered. Water seeped in through the old windows. And yet, no one panicked. They stayed close, shared blankets, sang softly. Keanu moved through the darkness like a guardian, checking on each person, one by one. In the corner, Ruthie clutched her folder of poems against her chest, afraid they might get wet. Keanu sat beside her and held the folder with her until the lights flickered back on. Outside, trees had fallen. Some buildings nearby had suffered serious damage. But the shelter stood. It always did. In the days that followed, volunteers poured in to help clean up. The storm had left a mess, but not despair. If anything, it had only strengthened the community. There was laughter during cleanup. People shared stories about surviving the night. Jonah wrote a new song and taught it to the others. It became their unofficial anthem. We fall, we rise, / we stumble. We try / but here, we are seen / and here, we don't lie. Keanu listened to the song quietly, then asked Jonah for a copy of the lyrics. He slipped them into the back of his notebook. Another echo to carry forward. One evening, as golden light poured into the garden and birds returned to their perches, Keanu sat on the bench with Melissa. You've been here a long time, she said gently. He nodded. Do you ever think about leaving? Going back to the world out there? Keanu looked at the garden. The flowers that had survived the storm, blooming brighter now. I think about what I can still give, he said. And right now, that still means being here. Melissa smiled. But one day, he looked up at the sky. One day, maybe, not to escape, but to spread what I've learned. You can only give your heart fully when you know who you are beneath all the noise. Melissa reached into her bag and pulled out a small wrapped box. This is for you, she said. He opened it slowly. Inside was a new notebook, leather-bound, simple, but elegant. On the front, etched in gold, were the words, "For the man who reminded us we were still human." Keanu's throat tightened. He didn't speak. He just nodded, holding the notebook like it was a sacred thing. The final pages of his old notebook were nearly filled. One night, sitting by the window, watching the rain tap softly against the glass, he wrote, "This story began with laughter, the kind that hurts, that mocks, that makes others feel small. But it ends in something deeper. Not applause, not recognition, but connection. I didn't come here to save anyone. I came here to sit with them in their silence. And in doing so, I found my own voice again. Maybe that's the real miracle. That in the quiet corners of a loud world, we can still find each other. And maybe, just maybe, we can find ourselves too. Time passed. People came and went. Some healed and moved on. Some stayed to help others. The shelter remained, not perfect, but filled with light. The wall of light grew so full, they had to add a second wall. And then a third. And Keanu. He stayed as long as he needed to. Then one day, he was gone. No farewell, no note, just his old jacket, folded neatly on his bunk, and a copy of Still Human tucked inside the pocket. But he was never really gone. Because in every letter on the wall, in every song Jonah played, in every poem Ruthie read, in every tear Bradley shed as he hugged his daughter again, there was a piece of him, a light, a truth, a quiet man with tired eyes who once chose to sit among the broken, not to fix them, but to remind them they had never stopped mattering.